EPIC is an interdisciplinary research group working out of the Department of Economics at U Chicago. And in India, we've been working for the last couple of years now. We work in the interdisciplinary area of energy and environmental policy / economics. And we work, typically, most of our projects involve working with the government as closely as we can. And currently, we're working in several states in the country, primarily on power sector distribution reforms or environmental regulation. We've also, over the last year, we've worked with the Delhi government in running the Delhi Innovation Challenge, which many of you may know about. We are looking to, the idea was to crowdsource interesting interventions in the energy and environment area pertinent to Delhi, and pilot them and evaluate these. We are looking to start implementation of some of these projects soon, and we're really looking forward to that. The seminar series is sort of an ongoing initiative which has been supported by the Tata Centre for Development as a project of the TCD, sponsored by the Tata Trusts. And the idea is to bring together researchers, decision makers, and the general audience interested in energy and environment problems, and sort of create a platform for discussion and debate. So today we are delighted to have Johannes here to present some of his work. Johannes is Associate Professor of Political Science at Columbia. He's been a prolific author, for those of you who are familiar with his work. More than 100 refereed articles in leading social science journals such as the American Journal of Political Science, International Organization, and the Journal of Politics. His current research focuses on finding practical solutions to political problems surrounding sustainable development in developing countries, and therefore he's been working in several countries in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. He's been working quite a bit in India, I know from your Facebook feed that you're constantly looking to improve your Hindi and practicing words and so on. So delighted to introduce him today, and looking forward to your talk. Thanks, Johannes.
Excellent. Well, thanks to Santosh for a very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for attending today's talk. So today I'm going to talk about an experiment that we did on off-grid solar power in the state of Uttar Pradesh, together with a company called Meragal Power, which provides sort of basic electricity services using a very minimal system of solar power. And our goal was to understand to what extent this kind of minimal level of energy access can change things and produce benefits in rural India. And the motivation here really comes from the fact that even though India's electrification rates are increasing over time, the fact remains that there are still hundreds of millions of people who don't have electricity. And so despite this increased rate of household electrification, the population without service remains large. And many people have proposed that solar power might be a possible solution to this problem. So solar is a good solution in principle for a country like India. It's a very sunny country, and most of around the year, in most months, there's plenty of sunlight available. Solar is a very flexible solution. It can be implemented on a reasonably small scale. So there's a lot of reasons to consider it. But the fact is that the use of solar still remains quite small. So in the 2011 census of India, fewer than 1% of households said that solar is their primary source of electricity. Today, of course, it would be more, and there are many, many more households that use solar as a secondary solution. But we are really interested in the case of a household that doesn't have a grid connection or some other alternative. What happens to them when they gain access to solar power? Okay. And the literature on this is quite interesting. There's obviously been a huge interest in the socio-economic benefits of electricity itself. Many studies have been done, and what those studies sort of typically find is this pattern where it's not clear whether in the short run some of these electrification programs are worth it, in the sense that they're often very expensive, and without some complementary interventions or other forms of development, they don't always provide some kind of a direct payoff in terms of sort of large-scale economic transformation. But at the same time, if you look in the long run, when societies develop what would happen if they did not have electricity. There's not a single modern society without electricity in the world. So in some sense, there is a kind of almost a commonsensical notion that in the long run, we do need electricity for modern life and convenience. The thing where there's been a little less study is the use of off-grid of solar power. There's been a number of studies with sort of somewhat mixed results. Some studies have found positive benefits in specific areas, whether those are fuel savings, children's education. Others have found less evidence of the same thing. And I think overall the sort of verdict on off-grid and the understanding of what are the conditions under which different kinds of off-grid solar systems can provide benefits, that's an early stage research program. And we want to contribute to it by looking at a minimal level of service. And of course, EPIC is a nice place to present this because I know that some of the staff here, including Anand Sudarshan, for example, have done similar work using off-grid in the state of Bihar. So we work in UP, they work in Bihar, and we can kind of compare the results as a result. Of course, theoretically, I think it is important to look at off-grid in particular because it is very different from grid electricity in many ways. One of them is that typically off-grid systems provide less power. In principle, you could have an off-grid system that allows you to run all kinds of appliances, but most of the systems out there focus on very basic technologies like lighting, mobile charging, maybe a fan, but rarely much more than that. And that's because the cost of generating large amounts of power with solar actually remains quite high. The other reason, on the other hand, is that grid electricity in many states of India is not a very reliable source of electricity. So some households say that, what do I do with my grid connection if I get 3 or 4 hours a day? And typically I get them when I don't need the electricity. So if you instead had a solar system with a battery, you could use the power when you need it. So it's not at all obvious in some sense what the differences between off-grid and grid power would be. The way I'm going to sort of structure the rest of the talk is that I'm first going to tell you about Maragall power, because I think the critical thing for understanding these kinds of studies is always to understand what exactly is being done. What is the model, what has been done. Then I'll tell you about the research design, the experimental setup that we use, and then I'll get to results. Here, I forgot to update this slide. Don't worry, we have final, not preliminary results. So I have some confidence in these results. This is a bit out of date. Here is a picture of Mr. Sandeep Pandey, who is the CEO of Maragall Power. This is a picture I took a few years back when we were starting this project, when we were visiting some of the villages. This is their solar panel, and we are just sort of looking at it and talking about how the system works. And the goal, of course, is this. Here is a picture of a young boy who's studying using solar power. So the goal of, and in some sense the aspiration of these off-grid companies often is that they say that even if we provide a minimal level of service, there are many reasons to believe that it can be very important when the alternative is unreliable or no electricity. And this picture kind of indicates the idea that maybe, for example, education could improve as a result of access to electricity, even if it's a very basic level of electricity access without any possibility of, let's say, rural industry or something like that. The business model works like this. So Maragall Power, unlike many of the off-grid companies that you might have heard of, has taken a kind of a no bells and whistles approach. So their approach is to take the simplest possible technological approach so that they can bring down the capital cost and then sort of that way expand their operation faster. So there is no pay-as-you-go, there is no cloud server for collecting data. All of those things are missing. It's a very simple system. So what they provide is they provide these 2 LED lights with the mobile charging app. And the price that they charge these households is 100 rupees per month. And that, if you do the math, it's not a crazy amount of money in the sense that many households can afford it. But if you do the math on sort of per unit cost, of course, this is a very expensive way of generating electricity. So Maragall Power thinks of itself more as a service provider than as an electric utility. Okay. It's a DC system, so it doesn't allow any of these sort of fancier things that you can do with AC power, but that's fine because the goal is only to provide basic lighting and mobile charging, so there's no need to have these sort of more expensive features. The installation cost at the time when we did this of one system was about $1,800 to $1,000. So this is very low. This is lower than what most provide. And the typical system can cover about 20 households. So the Maragao system model works such that they require 10 subscribers in a habitation. If they get 10 people to sign up, they go and install, and then they have the hope that over time it would increase to the maximum capacity of 20. Beyond that, because of the limitations of carrying power over geography with the DC system, they try to duplicate and have a second system than just trying to expand the current one. It's more expensive. Reliability, generally based on our experience, tends to be pretty good. There are difficult times, so the peak of the monsoon when the sun doesn't shine that much, and then the fog period in UP, December, January. Those are the times when consumers call the hotline and complain about the lack of supply and so on. Most of the year, however, they can get the typical sort of, let's say, 5 hours of electricity at night from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. Most households can afford. There's a difference question than whether they want to afford it, are they actually willing to pay for it, but most could basically by just replacing their kerosene consumption move into solar if they want it. Turns out that's a complicated decision and there is no sort of obvious movement where everybody would do it. At the time when we finished the project, Maragao Power had about 2,000 systems in the field in about 1,500 habitations. I don't have more recent numbers. This was about a year or 18 months ago. Whether they've expanded, whether they've kept the same, I don't really know. Okay, so in terms of the benefits, so the way we designed this study, because this was one of the first studies on off-grid, we took a sort of fairly expansive approach. So we took multiple possible benefits and we tried to provide some sort of simple and expedient ways to measure them. So we were not zooming in on any specific issue like education or something, but we instead kind of covered all the things we found in the literature that people could study. So one of them might be quality. So kerosene wicks don't provide very excellent lighting. The lumens available from kerosene are quite limited. Cost might go down per unit of lumen again. Kerosene tends to be cheap, but if you want to have bright lighting using kerosene, then you have to start buying a lot of black market, private market kerosene, which is expensive, and as a result, the cost might go up. There are also some health and safety issues. So kerosene does produce indoor air pollution. Whether that is a significant component of what the rural households experience depends largely on whether they cook inside. Because of course, if they cook with firewood, then this is a pretty small concern compared to that. But if they are one of those households who cook mostly outside, then it might be that the kerosene actually plays a role in the margin. And then there is a safety consideration in the sense that kerosene fires are common. So if the kerosene wick turns over or something, it's possible that the home burns down and somebody might get injured and so on. There is also this idea that improving lighting in particular might enable small household business. So if you have some activities that require kind of good eyesight, so whether it's sari decoration or baking for roadside vending, there might be some benefits having improved lighting. And then finally, for this particular model, one of the nice things about this, because the cost of each system is pretty low, you don't necessarily need a kind of a massive upfront injection of capital. You can actually kind of do this with fairly limited amounts of initial investments. Maragao Power is not based on subsidies, so they don't take these subsidies that kind of the government of India provides. And the reason largely is that the paperwork and the kind of administrative requirements of taking advantage of those, whatever 30-40% subsidies, is actually quite substantial. So they decided that if we cannot make it work without the subsidies, it's probably too risky for us. And in principle, it's easy to scale. I'm not trying to sort of pitch here and make an investment to Maragao Power or anything, but in principle, this is easy to scale because systems are easy to build. So there is no sort of major physical or regulatory difficulty to that expansion. Okay, there are limitations. So one of the big ones that always comes up with these kinds of designs is that these productive loads are really just not available. Maragao Power doesn't provide enough power to run any kind of big appliances or equipment that might allow you to really kind of take the rural livelihood generation to the next level. That's just not possible given the high unit cost. Nobody would take this kind of a system. There are separate initiatives from mini grids and all that sort of somewhat larger systems, but Maragao Power doesn't do any of that, so we don't have a lot to say about that. And as a result, this is not something that you could use for things like irrigation or rural industry. And then there is, some people bring up some of these equity considerations. There's a kind of a debate on this, but some people say that if you look at the unit cost of the villages and take into account the sort of fact that the subsidized grid electricity is available for others, is this really a kind of a fair way to provide this? And the providers then responded, well, the alternative is kerosene. Nobody's forced to do this. They can choose to stay outside, and there is a kind of a debate in some sense between the industry and the civil society on to what extent this is fair and equitable. This has in fact come up in some of the regulatory proceedings recently, because some states and also the central government has started to formulate these mini-grid policies, and they sometimes condition the subsidy on a certain price range. They don't say that you have to necessarily provide kind of affordable electricity, but if you want our subsidy, you must remain below certain costs. So this is a policy issue that's very much timely right now. So here's how we did this experimental design. So overall, we have 101 unelectrified habitations. Out of these, 81 are the main sample, and then we have 20 that are kind of outside as a check on whether there is something specific going on in this area. Unelectrified habitations is an interesting notion because, as you know, in most villages in India now, there is actually the grid, right? Not many households might be electrified, some habitations might be unelectrified, but almost every census village since the past 5 years or so has had some kind of a grid connection. So to find these habitations, we actually had to do some work, right? We had to go in and sort of say like, okay, here's an unelectrified place, this could be in our sample. We did not go into any electrified places because Maragao Power said that they're not interested in trying that. There are other operators, again, who provide higher levels of service, who have decided to go to electrified places and say, you can choose between the unreliable grid or you can pay more for our service, but Maragao Power doesn't do that. The area is Suratganj block in the Barabanki district of Uttar Pradesh. So this is east of Lucknow, pretty close, 90 minutes, 2 hours drive. Quite a poor place if you look at even by UP standards. It is below the sort of median level of wealth. And I personally think that this is a sort of reasonably good thing for our study, because these kinds of interventions don't make a lot of sense in very developed areas, right? There's no point in going and providing lights and mobile charging in some of the sort of wealthier areas of the country if everybody already has good access to grid or some other solutions. This is really an initiative that's targeted to the poorer areas of India. And the way we then did this is that we basically took 50 of the villages, of the habitations, and put them into so-called treatment group. These are the places where Maragao Power goes in and tries to install a microgrid. Now, here's the catch. We do this based on their business model. If the villagers don't want to pay, there is no installation. So we don't provide free microgrids, okay? We provide an opportunity to participate, or Maragao Power provides. Then there's 31 control habitations villages that are just there for measurement. There we tell Maragao Power you are not supposed to go there, okay? And then there are these 20 habitations outside Suratganj. These were to check for possible spillover effects and so on. Not much there, didn't see much, so I'm gonna talk about the 81 inside Suratganj mostly. In terms of the measurement, we mostly relied on surveys because we're trying to capture a large variety of different outcomes, so we could not kind of like zoom in and do some very sophisticated health measurements or something. But we did surveys. We did a baseline survey of all the habitations before the project. Then we did a so-called customer survey to check that things happened. There were actual microgrids people were using 3 months after. And then 6 months after, we did a midline, which is basically a copy of the baseline to measure outcomes. And then about 12 months after the installation, we did the endline survey of the study. So one thing to note here is that this is a reasonably short time period. I cannot comment based on this study on any sort of possible long-term effects. This is really on just whether there was a reasonably immediate effect. Okay. Here's the study setting on sort of Google Maps. The river is there. Lucknow is to the west. The literacy rate in our sample is about 35. That's low. Okay, so this is low. And you might wonder why. Well, one of the reasons is that here we are interviewing household heads who tend to be a little older than most of the population. So as a result, their schooling opportunities were less. But even then, if you compare this rate to other districts, this is below. So this is a more deprived area than most of UP, and UP in turn is more deprived than most of India. So we are at the bottom in that sense. Median monthly household expenditure is about 4,000 rupees. Again, a little below when you adjust for size and everything. Kerosene expenditure is, the median is 100 rupees. That's a very, very funny number. It's exactly the number that Maragao Power charges. So this turns out to be a very important aspect of our study. Okay. A little bit on the use of lights. So it's fascinating doing these studies when you start sort of thinking of what actually happens. It turns out that when we interviewed people and asked them sort of what do you do with the lights once you have them, most of them said that the sort of main use is actually outside lighting. This is a little surprising. I did not see this coming, but many people said that, you know, inside, I have two lights, I put one inside, I put the other one outside, but the outside one is important. It shows to people that I have it, is one important thing. Another one is that if I cook outside, I can use it for that as well. And then some people said, specifically mentioned cooking, some people said education, but outside lighting was really the sort of one commonality that people use lights for many things. This was the one thing that sort of 2/3 of our customers decided to use. Customer satisfaction in this early stage. Remember, this is done, the survey is done in like August, September, after the sort of peak of the monsoon. So this wasn't a bad time to use solar. You can see it's pretty high. So about 3/4 of the households said that they're happy with the service overall, with mobile charging and with lighting. Again, if we had done this same survey in December or at the peak of the monsoon, like early August or something, we would have gotten lower numbers because the quality of the service is lower. But in a good time, many of the customers seem reasonably happy with at least the basic service. Okay. Okay. So as for the measurement, what we did in this study was that we sort of broke our outcomes into two groups. The first one is basic energy or electricity access outcomes. These are things like kerosene expenditures. Do you have some kind of electricity source at your home? How many hours do you get? So this is just energy access. That's it. Then there's the second one, which is the socio-economic or second order outcomes. These are things like income, savings. Are you engaged in some kind of a home business? What are children's study habits? Is there some evidence of educational attainment? The limitation I again want to emphasize here is that we did not do a kind of a very deep dive into any one of these. We instead kind of like tried to get a broad view of all of them. There is a third aspect, which is things like social capital, female empowerment. We don't say a whole lot about that in this study because at some point you have to kind of, if you just keep adding more and more and more outcomes, at some point randomly some of them start to appear to be effects and all that. So we're going to focus mostly on the first and the second order, and the third order we are not going to talk that much. We did a little bit of study on this, but the results were not super sort of interesting necessarily there. Okay. I want to say a few words about implementing these kind of studies. So one of the things about doing experiments in the field is that it becomes more about management than about research. And we certainly had a rough time actually doing this. And the problems here were sort of multiple. One of them was simply, how do we get the Maragao Power team to go to the right habitations? Okay? Habitations don't have, unlike census villages, don't have clear codes. They often have multiple names. Same area may have very many habitations with the exact same name. Often these habitations are very simple names like Muslim habitation, or they might be named after a river or something. So we had to do a lot of work to get this, and in fact we were not entirely successful. There were 4 places in our control group where Maragao Power installed even though they were not supposed to. We did not push them to remove those installations because that would have created a big practical problem. Given our statistical design, we can adjust for this because we use this so-called instrumental variable strategy where the assignment predicts actual installation and things sort of work out just fine with that, but this was a problem. Then we had one more issue, which was flooding. So because we are very close to the river and we tried to do some of these installations over the summer, there were some places where we were simply not able to do this. If you have flooding in a habitation, you cannot install this system. It's just not possible. And as a result, we had to give up on those. It would have caused too much delay. There was 5 of them. In terms of the customers, we see a very interesting pattern. So in the baseline, of course, we have none. It's good, fine. That's how it should be. In the midline, we had 132 in our survey, We didn't survey everybody. We did 16 surveys per habitation. In practice, if I do the math by habitation size, I would say we had maybe 300 customers overall. In the end line, the number decreased. So there were a number of people who had taken the connection about 6 months in, but then they decided to drop it. Okay? Could be again, at some point they realized that, okay, we are paying 100 rupees a month, we are not happy with this, we're not getting enough benefits. It could again be the timing of the end line. There's many possible reasons. Many of these people said that, okay, we are just not very happy with sort of this wasn't a good investment. The one thing that's also very interesting about the customers that I want to emphasize is that this idea of sort of dynamic learning, where the customer base would expand significantly over time, did not realize. So almost all the customers who we did have in the end line were people who had taken it in 1 or 2 months. And my personal hypothesis is that lighting is a pretty basic thing. People look around, is it working? If it is, they take it. There's no need to observe your neighbors for 6 to 9 months, do a complicated calculation, and then decide. The other reason, of course, is that there's no risk trying. These 40 or so households that decided to drop it may have thought, okay, we can pay 100 rupees a month for a few months. After all, we don't need to make a big initial investment. If we are not happy, we'll just drop it. Okay? Because Mergao Power doesn't require a big deposit. They just require the sort of kind of an equivalent of the monthly fee in the beginning, and that allows households to try the technology more easily. Okay. This one is probably a little tough to read because of the size of the screen. I need to do this on a stadium or something for this to work. But what I just want to emphasize here is kind of the geography in the sense that the different colors indicate different outcomes. So, for example, the green ones here are the ones where we tried to install things. The gray ones are the gray ones are control group. And others are things like flooding or remote habitation. And I think the only take home here is that in general, the patterns are not systematic. So in some sense, our randomization from a geographic perspective seems reasonably decent. Okay. Estimation for those of you who are kind of in this specific field. So we do 2 things. The first one is the so-called intent to treat, where we just look at, is there a difference in places where the Mergao Power tried to go versus the places where they did not go, okay? This is a kind of a conservative or kind of a lower bound estimate because it doesn't take into account the fact that in some places they did not install. And then we do the so-called local average treatment effect estimation where we look at where the installation influenced things. We can also take this on one more level where we look at households actually adapting, and the results then are pretty much the same as in the local average treatment effects, except the effects are bigger. We've done the baseline balance for all kinds of socio-economic. We've done it. Everything checks out very nicely. So it looks like even though our sample is pretty small, the randomization was successful, and we have kind of comparable groups, which is nice. And then we did a power analysis, which kind of suggests that for our main variables, we can detect reasonable impacts. Okay? This is important because especially when you report results that there was no impact, there's 2 reasons why that could happen. One is there is no impact. The second is your study is poorly designed and you cannot detect an impact that exists. So we put some time into sort of making sure that we would avoid the second one, which would force me to give a talk and say, I don't know what's going on. That would probably be quite disappointing for all of you who decided to come here, right? Okay, let's get to the results now. So the way you can read this regression table is that panel A shows kerosene expenditure on the private market. So this is the non-subsidized kerosene. Panel B shows kerosene spending from the public distribution system where it's heavily subsidized. And the treatment row indicates the effect of the treatment, estimated with the intent to treat effect on the left, models 1 and 2, and with the local average treatment effect on models 3 and 4. And as you can see, there's a pretty clear impact on the private market consumption. So in habitations where installation happens, you get about a 50 rupee decrease on typical private market expenditures. That's not enough to cover the 100 rupees, but keep in mind that many people did not take this service. So there were certainly some people who were consuming 100 rupees or more in private and who completely stopped using that. So there seems to be a substantial substitution of kerosene away for solar. So this kind of fuel expenditure saving model seems to work. The other things, just note that the pre-program typical consumption for private was 72. So most of that disappeared as a result of this program, but not all. If you then look at the subsidized kerosene, you see nothing, right? All of these coefficients are very small, and they're certainly very far from any kind of meaningful statistical degree of significance. And this, again, makes a lot of sense, right? Think about somebody who's getting very heavily subsidized kerosene. Even if you get the solar, when you can basically buy kerosene almost for free, you might be able to sell it to a middleman as a diversion. You might use it for other uses. You might use it for lighting the stove, or you might use it to even run if you have a small pump. Some people are pretty sophisticated at using these things. You would still keep using this. And this is something that I want to emphasize from a practical perspective, is that if you think about the extent of adoption and demand, without the kerosene subsidy, we would be living in a very different world. I think we would have a lot more customers if kerosene was not so heavily subsidized. So what's happening here in some sense is that the kerosene subsidy provided by the government of India is in some sense sort of undermining the solar subsidy that they're also providing, or the idea of creating solar markets. And I think this is very important for understanding that there are two different sources of kerosene that people use. On the energy access side, one thing that is encouraging is that if you just ask a simple question, does this household in a habitation have access to some kind of electricity? This program was pretty effective in that. Now you might want to say, okay, of course it was. I mean, you're providing electricity, right? But this is not a good way to think about the issue, because you have to keep in mind that at the same time there is a government program on grid extension. There might be some other alternatives. Relative to that point, this local average treatment effect estimates say that we do about 30 percentage points better than Uttar Pradesh would have done otherwise. It's a minimal level of access, but that coefficient is so big that it kind of shows that expanding this, if your goal is just to get basic access, that seems to work. On the other hand, a very interesting thing on hours of electricity, there doesn't seem to be much of an effect. The coefficients are always positive, but they are not statistically significant. There's a lot of uncertainty around this. This is quite a puzzling result, right? Because you're providing electricity for people. When you do the technical checks and everything, it seems like something is being provided, but not much happens. And one of the reasons that might be happening here, my sort of hypothesis would be that in some of these sort of other areas where you don't have this, there is this sort of pattern where some people start investing on things like, I don't know, batteries or something, and they were able to significantly increase the degree of hours that they have. At the same time, in the solar habitations, there are households who decide not to do this, and when you put those two things together, the effect kind of washes out. But this is quite a disappointing result, I have to say, that the hours did not go up in a kind of a significant and robust way. Okay. I'm not even going to show you the tables for the socio-economic effects because there are none. Okay? For most of these cases, regardless of how we estimate, we get very small coefficients. The confidence intervals are not very wide. And as a result, that suggests that we're really talking about just no change happening. And this is true for all of these different indicators that we use. There's a few cases where there's some uncertainty. So for example, the savings coefficient, the confidence intervals are wide. It might actually be big or it might be negative. But for most of these, it's not just that there's a lot of uncertainty, but it really is that we are estimating zeros. So this sort of broader transformation that was in some sense the ultimate motivation for doing this did not happen in this study. Yeah, Santosh. Yeah, not much changing there. This is very interesting. So even though people are able to, here's my hypothesis, even though people get the basically free phone charging now, what happens in practice is that the cost of phone charging in these areas was so low already that the sort of potential for decrease is quite limited. I was very surprised by this because I went in expecting this to be a high cost. One of the things that seems to be happening in this area is that there are some sort of entrepreneurs who are very creative. They have these batteries. They charge them at night using the grid connection. They go to the villages and say, if you want to pay 2 or 3 rupees, you can charge. And as a result of that, then, given that these are very poor people, they don't have smartphones, they have these like robust 1990s Nokias. As a result, the sort of total cost is not so high. Okay, so let me now conclude with some sort of broader thoughts. Okay, so we've done an experiment. We found results that are, I think, mostly not what we hope to see, but this is how our reality is. But let's think a little bit about, sort of more carefully about the policy and kind of broader implications of this study. So we see kind of good first order effects on kerosene and electricity access. So in that sense, the MGP services, when you implement this program, you are getting basic electricity service to people. So that sort of minimal degree of achievement, we can check that box. Okay. There is no socio-economic transformation. So the idea that this kind of minimal electricity access, the way it was done in this program, that it would sort of in some sense substitute for whether it's a bigger system, some kind of a robust program of mini grids, or whether it's, what I think is more important is kind of a power sector reforms that actually improve the quality of service. I don't think this minimal electricity access can really sort of leapfrog in that sense. If there's leapfrogging, it needs to come from a different technology, or alternatively, we need to go back and work on the power sector even harder than we've been doing so far. At the same time, modest cost reductions could significantly increase demand. So obviously, one of the things that we saw that was pretty striking was the difference between the PDS kerosene and the private kerosene. If there was no PDS kerosene, I think we would have had a lot more demand for this service. So in some sense, you can then ask, in what sense is this a fair assessment of this program if there is another public policy that deliberately undermines this program? And so one of the hopes here is that maybe we can hope that EPIC India can push that a little bit, would be that if the kerosene subsidy could be replaced with direct cash transfers in the future, and people can make a kind of a fair and neutral choice between basic solar and kerosene. I think that could result in some better outcomes. Some implications for things that we could think about. One of them is the potential of larger systems. So in principle, of course, a mini grid can basically replicate everything the grid does. You could build a 50 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt solar system and start giving people power, and I'm sure you would get sort of much more varied uses and different impacts. The challenge there is that you need to start thinking about the cost very carefully. Okay, so if I saw an impact assessment of a very big system producing positive results, my first question would be at what cost? Okay, because it could be that the capital cost for those systems is very high, and in those cases, then again, it's not clear that it's actually a net improvement over the grid. Whereas in this case, given that the capital cost is so low, at least you can kind of say that even if we gave everybody electricity using this system, the capital cost would actually be quite low. Grid extension. Grid extension is an interesting feature, because what seems to be happening in India right now is that village electrification rates are going up. Even within villages, sort of larger and wealthier habitations tend to get connections. So it might be that in the future, a kind of a main role for off-grid is actually this kind of filling the gaps. If there are some habitations that are, for whatever reason, difficult to electrify right now, then these kind of basic systems might be a kind of a temporary solution, or even, who knows, with technological progress, we've seen a lot of technological progress, maybe even a permanent solution. But there is this kind of interesting change of the mindset where when we started doing this work 4 years ago, there was this idea that we are just not going to expand the grid anymore, and we are just going to provide these off-grid systems. That seems not to be happening in India. It might be happening in Africa where the distances are longer and so on, but here it seems more that the off-grid sector is kind of living in the sort of amid an expanding grid. Okay? And then finally, there is the question of complementary interventions. So one criticism that you could launch against our study is that you could say that, okay, so all you've done is provided lighting. Even if you take seriously the claim that lighting can be important for whatever sari decoration or baking or taking care of your livestock or something, shouldn't you at least try to make some kind of an effort to help these villages to start these activities? Maybe provide credit, maybe training, help people gain access to markets, right? Because in some sense, from an economic perspective, lighting alone can only solve a problem if lighting is the only constraint for improvement, right? And if lighting is the only constraint on improvement, you could ask, why haven't they solved it already? Why don't they have a diesel generator? If there's such a great profit potential here, why haven't they solved it already? So this kind of theoretical thinking in sort of what the picture is for off-grid, what its role is in energy policy in India and elsewhere, I think is something that we should try to tackle in the coming years. I thank all of you very much for your attention, and I hope we can have a good discussion and debate as well. Thank you.
You ask about lighting for study, and I'm wondering if that's not sufficient. You need to ask something about the quality of lighting, because with the kerosene lamp you get lighting for studying, but with this also you get lighting. So if you just ask a question, did it change? Did you get lighting for studying? You may not see the difference. You may miss the advantage that this brings. The other question I have is, did you, in order to explore this a little further, did you talk to the people, like a focus group, or just something to try and understand what is actually going on? My guess is you may have found, if you ask them, are you happier with this? You might have got a different answer. And I think the benefit of this may be hidden in that answer.
Okay, so on the first point, I fully concede that education is one of our sort of weaker aspects, that it could be that there is, first of all, it's possible that the quality of the lighting should be the one that we should focus on. And then there is, of course, the second possibility that ultimately in education we care about attainment, but we don't have here a kind of a built-in module for testing children or anything like that. So on that, let's take the results with a grain of salt. I think sort of when you look at all the different results together and kind of like the patterns of behavioral change, I would be surprised if there was a big educational effect. And one of the reasons is theoretical. In fact, if you think about a parent who really cares about their children's education, if lighting is the problem, wouldn't they go and just buy a battery and provide a good light regardless of Maragall power? So there is this, again, this sort of thinking that if you really care about this, you would try to find the solution in any case. On the second point, we actually did quite a bit of that. So one of the things we did is we did an open-ended survey of both people using the technology and people not using it, and ask like, so what do you use electricity for? Do you have electricity? What are your sort of hopes? And so on. And I think the pattern that we got from this is that, of course, there is the fundamental fact that some people pay 100 rupees a month and they keep paying over the entire period. They must have gotten some benefits from this. But I don't think there is some kind of a sort of fundamental hidden sort of big welfare benefit here, because if there was, then I think we would see over time sort of much higher adoption rates. At some point, their neighbors would realize that these are amazing homes, we need to have those. So I think there must be something here. They wouldn't be paying the 100 rupees if they were not happy, but it just doesn't seem that it's necessarily something that kind of extends to the entire population. It's a small number of people who decide to keep paying.
So my curiosity stems from the fact that, I actually want to know whether the technology didn't work or whether it was the cost. And you actually showed us a slide which talked about the satisfaction. And 3/4 of your customers actually said that they are pretty satisfied. So can you tell us about the sample size, that because you said that initially 300 you started with 300 customers, which actually dropped to 132. So was this survey taken by?
Okay, so I think this is very important to clarify, and this is a source of endless confusion in these kind of studies. So the customers that I'm listing here are the people in our survey. The way I arrive at 300 in the midline is by taking into account that a typical habitation has 40 households, and we surveyed only 16. So I do a division by, 40 divided by 16. So the collapse is not as drastic as that would imply. The collapse is that about 1/3 of the people drop it. In terms of the satisfaction, so that survey, let me see, where is it? Here. What we did here is that we surveyed everybody who at that time had the service in our sample again. So this is about 130 people. And given that our sample was random, and I think the sort of sampling worked pretty well, I think this gives a pretty good picture of where this is. If you do the math and you look at the number of people who are unsatisfied, that's about the percentage that dropped the service. So in some sense, this seems to capture something rather well. On the technology sort of working on its own, this is one piece of evidence. We also tried to kind of gain a sort of a qualitative understanding of what's happening. And our understanding was that for most of the year, the problems were minor. If there was an issue, they sent somebody to repair and so on. It was really the peak of the monsoon and then the December, January fog that caused serious problems. These were the times, especially the fog period at our study was very bad. And these were the times when people literally said that, I'm done with this. I'm not going to pay anymore. I'm going to drop the service. That was a big sort of loss for Maragall Power. No, not entirely. I mean, there's always some delay in the implementation. But what happened was that Maragall Power has a very sort of specific system where there's a specific time of the year when they go and try to electrify as fast. And in practice, what happened in our case was that we tried to electrify beginning of April, but this was the election time. This was the Modi election. That did not work out. So the politicians went around and said, everybody gets free electricity after the election. Don't worry. There's absolutely no need to use this. One of the Maragall guys was thrown in jail for a week for trying to challenge this sort of fantastic idea. After the elections, as soon as it was over, after some long and tough negotiations, Maragall Power agreed to be very aggressive, and we were able to electrify this in about 3 months. So the reason from the company's perspective is that because the systems are very small, the cost of generating the electricity per unit is very high. Okay? That's the main reason, that they don't benefit the economies of scale from power plants. And then the second issue, of course, is that electricity in India generally is subsidized, though to what extent and where and how, I'm not going to comment on that. But the main issue is the unit cost. That the only way to bring this cost down to the grid level or something with this technology would be a very aggressive subsidy by the government.
So I guess the first question is, do you have any data on whether access to grid electricity increased over time in the control villages in particular? Because the hours of supply, I mean, there might be something that's happening there. You gave a couple of explanations, but presumably you have the data to. So what happened there?
So I can answer that. This is very interesting. Grid extension, not so much. Very disappointing progress on grid extension. But battery use increased significantly. For some reason, in that area at that time, there was a massive expansion of sales of Chinese batteries. And this was something that really did increase in the control, both in the control and in the treatment villages.
It'd be really nice to have the table in there. Because it would give a. I mean, that's fascinating. And do you know if people fell off the Maragall, especially the guys who dropped off? Do you know what they did afterwards? Did they go back to kerosene or?
This is a great question. We haven't checked, but we can, right? Because we interview them regardless of whether they continue. We haven't checked that, so if I had to guess, I would imagine at least some of them would then go and move into batteries. But I'll check that and maybe I'll follow up on that. That's a great idea.
The next question was, I mean, I think the most significant result here is on the kerosene expenditure.
Right.
So here too, a median consumption of 100 rupees per month. With PDS, it's still 3 liters, 3 to 4 liters. I don't know whether it's
3 at our
3 liters at 15 rupees per
month. Something
15
like
rupees
that.
per liter. So that's 45 rupees there.
That's right.
The rest of it is from the private market.
That's right.
Okay. And cool. All right. So, I mean, I guess the question would have been how much of the use in baseline, midline, endline were on private kerosene. And
okay, so if you look at the sort of pattern pre-experiment, I would say the typical household used maybe 60 to 70% private and 30 to 40 PDS.
Do you intend to say that, I mean, with these power companies, traditional power companies, they won't be able to set up that sort of infrastructure, because of huge debts, that they owe to the financial institutions, or for that matter, the land acquisition, there's a lot of bureaucracy in that, and there's also a lot of crony capitalism, So do you intend to say that that sort of business model won't be able to work for the entire system, and they will be always going to be, more based on the more market based rather than, focusing on the entire country, population of the entire country, because these type of models will work only in the short run. These type of models have been launched by the government, also by this government, by the previous government, but they suit, people for the very long term, for the very short term, and they are not, they won't have long-term benefits, for people to switching to, these renewables or to, so that they will be able to use it in the long term. That's it.
So there are some efforts such as the Smart Power India program where they've tried to set up some of these sort of mini grids. So mini grid is bigger than microgrid on a more permanent basis, and with the idea that they're trying to turn it into a sustainable business model. I think the difficulty with that and kind of understanding how that works is that, of course, as an entrepreneur, you first go to the places where you can make business the easiest. So whether you can go from the first 100 villages to the next 1,000 and the next 10,000 remains unclear. I think the other issue to keep in mind, of course, is that the Indian electricity service picture is very varied across states. So when we did a big energy access survey together with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, we found that some places like West Bengal are doing pretty well these days. And if that's the case, the demand for some kind of an alternative is not as clear. It's really these places like UP and Bihar where the power sector itself is facing challenges that the potential for these companies comes. But I do think there are many challenges, and we will have to see in the coming years to what extent these entrepreneurs and regulators find ways around them.
So I would like to congratulate you for carrying such an experience, research experience. It was much needed. But in India, and when we are talking about rural areas, this requirement of energy is very heterogeneous. Because what we are aiming for, 2 LED lights and maybe charging a mobile. So this doesn't, take care of the 24-hour days needs. When life also shuttles between agricultural practices and home. And I'm in a university very close to village areas in Uttar Pradesh, Western Uttar Pradesh. What I find that they are out of electricity from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. I asked why. They said that we get agricultural, that supply. So as it is dark, there is no agriculture to be done. So it snaps. Now I can't comment on this, that they have some alternative lines and they get it. Now this is in rural areas. So obviously assured source of energy is needed. But just for the light doesn't satisfy even the poorest home actually. Then the conventional and more dependable, the lady is comfortable with, those factors are there. So we have to really push in very gently, and maybe a lot of education is needed in this area. Awareness and education. And the work is very much needed at this level. Because what I find, there is a village of, 500 household, and I would like it to have solar nearest to my university. So I would like to see it like this. There are many issues. 5 years back, there was only one home having your generator, battery-driven generator. Now there might be more, but it is that kind of rural, without any basic thing, But if we are having just 2 lights, I think a household is not comfortable with that. Maybe we are aiming here for something, and they look at it at a very large, that it will solve everything maybe. And if it is not, then it is not our. So we should not lose heart, and I think the possibility of this solar energy is tremendous in rural areas. It will be, in long run, it will serve purpose.
Yeah, hi. So, we completed a very similar evaluation and a very similar methodology in Bihar, actually very close to the UP border, where we were also evaluating a solar microgrid product with a private company, which was 2 bulbs and a mobile charging unit. And the evaluation period was about 2.5 years. Of course, we had more delays in the actual rollout and deployment, so it's very possible that the average amount of time that a person had the connection was very similar. And I think that very broadly, we found similar findings in that, at the price of 100 rupees, there was strong demand. We also had an additional price. Their unsubsidized price was 200 rupees, which is significantly more expensive, and that was not sustainable in terms of being able to support a level of demand so that they could actually feasibly connect in villages. And then we did see, over time, people started paying for these connections, and then over time there was continued attrition. We also were really household welfare impacts that are sort of promised in the glossy advertising of these companies, although, effects on basically the appliances that were issued. So they did get more lighting. Interestingly, we did not see as much lighting outside the house. We saw more lighting inside the house, which I think is a different in terms of Bihar and UP. But people had lights. People, like children, read more at night, yet based on Acer reading tests, really did not do significantly better, although we did see an interesting effect whereby if you're moving from the very bottom rung, so you basically can't recognize letters, then we saw a significant improvement in that. So, you may be able to get from the very bottom to a basic level of literacy, but you're not seeing, sustained growth. Again, we did see some, people bought more cell phones, people charged their phones more, people used their phone more. But in terms of time use, health, other impacts, we didn't see significant impacts similarly. I wanted to also comment, I thought it was very interesting, the charging times. I don't know, could you tell me the sizing of the grid? Again, what was the wattage of the panel?
So the typical panel would be, if you have 10 households, it would be about 200 watts. And then if you go up to 20, they would add another similar, so maybe 300-400 watts. Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know if there's actually a trade-off between the charging and the lighting. So households in our sample found that they tried to charge their phones during the day, and then instead of charging the battery, they were using the power, and then they didn't have lighting at night.
Very interesting.
So then they were, kind of making that trade-off, and the staff, the recharge staff, was kind of actively discouraging them from keeping the phones plugged in all day. So I don't know if there is some sort of trade-off there where you're seeing people are just, have figured this out essentially. Yeah.
So one comment on that now came to my mind is I've seen in some places what people do is they have whatever their main solution, whether it's Mergal Power or home system or something, but they also buy a tiniest possible solar panel just for mobile charging. And then they pay, that costs like $3 or something.
Are not nearly serving sort of the purpose that you aspire for them to be doing, and one reason could be that the product is poor, like the specific cases that what would the counter be? I mean, in the sense that is it the case that this particular model did not work, or is this what would be true for solar lighting or solar microgrids more generally?
I think one thing that I want to emphasize immediately is that if the cost of alternative fuel was a lot higher, for example, many African countries don't subsidize kerosene at all. In that case, you could see a very different, just the fuel saving itself could be so important that it could result in significant changes. So I know that Mergal Power had experimented, for example, in Haiti with some microgrids, and they said that their people pay 4 or 5 times as much for their lighting before the intervention. In a context like that, unless the company really sort of decides to squeeze all the profit out of the people, you could see much bigger impacts. So I think it's a combination of the way the technology is plus the context in which it's happening. In some sense, India might not be the best place for off-grid. It might be that Africa and other areas actually provide better opportunities.
I mean, I just, and related to what you already said, what is the learning for an enterprise from such a study? Because I'm curious to know if Meragaon Power actually learned something out of this, and because we assume that the basic energy axis is lighting, but it's not true. It's actually more than that. So if there is any learning that Meragaon Power has incorporated through this exercise.
I would say that I think it's unlikely, or at least I haven't seen learning in the sense that, hey, let's change our business completely. There's certainly a lot of learning. We've shared all the data and had sort of extensive discussions on what happened and everything. So there's been sort of more specific learnings on understanding the customers and so on. But I don't think, I think it's unlikely that an entrepreneur would sort of take an impact assessment and say that, okay, now we are going to do something completely different. I don't know if they have future plans for sort of expanding the scale or something, but at least so far I haven't seen anything like that.
Hi. In one of the slides, you mentioned about the median household expenditure as well as the median, 4,000 rupees and 100 rupees, right? So if we compare the two things, then the kerosene this is kerosene expenditure, okay. So it's almost 2.5% of the total consumption, right, or monthly expenditure, and which is equivalent to what they are paying to Meragaon Power. So, my question is, since they are just replacing the kerosene, the usage of the kerosene powered light with the Meragaon powered light, did you find any kind of expectation from the people that that we want something more from the Meragaon power rather than just replacing our old kerosene powered light than this new power light? So did you come across any kind of expectation from the people?
Certainly. I think there was a very clear, especially in the open-ended surveys that we did, there was a very clear sort of hope that in the future they would gain access to other appliances and so on. But I think the difficulty here again is that if you started providing that level of service, it would come with a 500 rupee monthly price tag, and then how many of these people who live among the sort of poorer habitations would be able to afford it? So there was a very clear aspiration that they want higher levels of service, but I'm not sure that it would sort of translate into a willingness and an ability to pay for those services at that point.
There is one area of entrepreneurship which is growing in rural area is e-rickshaw. So they want to recharge the batteries. This is growing, because they collect, either they are having 1 lakh rupees or 4 of them they get together for a business and buying one and driving, and sharing. So if it is targeted that, okay, we are providing a service which will charge this also, this is just another area. And then household means they will be charging overnight from say 9 p.m. to morning 9 p.m. So they will be charging it. There will be a requirement, and there is no power during that time also, because of this agricultural supply, it gets cut in the midnight also. They won't have any alternative. So if there is a dependable service through solar for charging, and then household things can be an added thing for that. Because, household runs either on agriculture, which is diminishing. The younger rural guys, they are not getting into agriculture. What I get from first-hand interviews and all. So this might be, that you support one first primary entrepreneurship like this, and then to light sources and charging thing. So because this seems to be very minor in 24-hour requirement of energy kind of thing.
So that's kind of an anchor load model where there's a primary service, whether it's a telecom tower or an e-rickshaw center, and then the sort of household connections come as a side benefit.
Actually, just wanted to draw my interest to attend this session was, I come from a company, Kane India. We have already implemented 2 of the pilot projects. One was in off-grid and one is in microgrid. we have just recently launched a impact assessment survey around it. What I wanted to know was A, the method that you have used to calculate, but B, I think that I differ from the outcomes that have so far come. Two reasons. A, we have seen that in the case of the microgrid that we installed in partnership with iEnergy and Sun Edison, was a 27 kilowatt microgrid in which close by 100 households were actually sourcing energy and sourcing electricity from them. The amount of idea generation around it was that even people who saw that through PDS system, when you go to get grains, right, you have to go to the market and then from there you actually go process it and come back. The idea generation to see that the electricity has reached them, there were people who installed grinding machines there for the entire community. So we have seen that, not only just saying that the electricity was provided at a household level, we also saw entrepreneurs coming up to use those technologies, and there were case studies to do it. So I really differ so far from what we have got as an eye experience, that it is definitely a mode we need to go rigorous about. And specifically also, Cane India was lucky because we operate in a place which is Barmer, which gets the maximum solar radiation in the entire world, I mean, entire India. So in that context, I think I just wanted to know the methodology, but so far I think the outcomes that we have seen is completely different from what your findings are. So if you can enlighten that, what are the specifics do you think that we should keep in as a parameter to assess? I mean, that would be quite a help for us because the study would be just conducted soon enough.
There's no example of a country overcoming poverty with mini systems and microsystems and so on. The Chinese tried this in the 50s. They had mini steel plants and mini factories and so forth. There was no solar in those days, but that failed completely. It was the great leap forward became the great leap backward. So there's no example of a country successfully overcoming problems of poverty through these kind of micro projects and mini projects.
I agree with what you're saying about the competition being between the solar entrepreneurs and the kerosene sellers, distributors, because the price of energy is almost the same. So do you think that probably the decision of sticking with Mera Gaon Power could have also been a result of the business relationships built over time, because these kerosene distributors would have operated in this area for much longer than Mera Gaon Power. These relationships are largely informal. And so do you think that maybe measuring sort of the intensity of this relationship over time and possibly allowing these people to own these solar lanterns for a much longer period of time than probably the study was conducted may have an impact on your results?
Okay, so 5 questions, I'll take them very quickly. On the industry side, I think we should all be very grateful for the Chinese. They're providing us with inexpensive solar technology, so thank you. I think the Chinese are doing a great thing. I don't think India should try to compete in a sector where they would probably lose pretty clearly. Let's buy the technology from them and focus on building a service industry here. Okay. On your measurement, I think you could, if you're interested in economic outcomes, you should do some kind of a habitation level economic activity assessment. But more important than that, your system is more than 100 times larger than ours. So the main thing you want to say is like, what is the cost of providing this benefit? Like, can you really make this sustainable in a financial sense? This, I think, is going to be the fundamental question. Countries. That is true that there is no country so far that has done it, but technology is evolving. And in the 19th century, there was no country that had used telephones for their economic growth and so on. So things are changing, and I think we need to kind of keep an eye on these trends and see. But I do agree that I don't think off-grid is going to replace grid. It's going to play its own role in filling specific pockets and niches and so on, at least in India. Okay, solar kerosene policy challenges. I think another thing is this subsidy policy that the way it's administered, it really favors big players with political connections. So either you should give a solar subsidy that's fair and easy to get sort of anybody who has a serious model, or alternatively, you should not give the subsidy, because getting the subsidy requires quite a bit of sort of getting around some obstacles and roadblocks, and that distorts competition. So the subsidy might cause problems there. On the sort of finally, there's one more question on the solar and kerosene. Can you just quickly remind me what was that? Oh, yes. Okay. So I don't think in this case those were so important, because what we saw was that there was a significant decrease in these private kerosene consumptions. The one that remained was the PDS. And that is so cheap that I would probably do the same thing and keep buying it. So in our case, we actually saw that the private consumption did decrease quite rapidly as a result of that. So that wasn't the problem there. This is... We didn't in a systematic way, but we got the sense that it was diversion plus some diesel pumps, those that can take it, plus then also this like ancillary uses like lighting the stove. And then other people, sometimes you need 3 lamps. So you use the kerosene for lighting even though you have the